Kia ora koutou katoa. I'm Dr. Renska Vanenbrink, and I'm a doctor who's also trained as a psychotherapist, and I'm one of the directors of Connect Communications. We're an education company who specialise in communication, well-being, and also in supervision skills, providing training for senior health professionals. We've been working closely with the veterinary profession over the last 4 or 5 years, both at a strategic level, working with leaders to create a wellbeing framework, and via academic routes, as well as at a more practical level with veterinary teams all around the country.
And I'm Dr. Fiona Moyer. I've got a background in general practice and I work part-time as a senior lecturer in communication skills and mental health at the University of Auckland, as well as being the other director of Connect. My PhD is actually focused on practitioner health, so I'm very glad to be involved in this important work with veterinary teams, alongside our involvement with doctors, pharmacists, nurses and dentists. And just as an aside, this is a very practical summary we're doing, but we do work with an evidence-based focus. Some of the main challenges to the wellbeing of veterinary teams in New Zealand over the last couple of years have been about managing increased pressure and conflict at work. And so Connect Communications worked with the VCNZ to provide a series of 4 webinars based around communication and wellbeing strategies. As these webinars were not recorded due to their interactive nature, we've summarised some of the key take-home points from them, and this may serve as a reminder or as an introduction to a topic.
So in deciding on these main points, we looked at some of the discussion that took place during the webinars and what appeared to be the priorities for the veterinary team members who attended. We've structured the summary into us summarising some of the key content, which we suggest you watch first, and this will be in 3 parts: communicating when there's a conflict, a couple of wellbeing topics, and lastly some comments on working in teams.
And there will be 2 role plays, quite a common angry interaction scenario, and then a more extreme situation where boundaries are needing to be set. And we hope that you can apply these skills to your own particular role. Lastly, we'll have a short Q&A session. We're going to think about the key communication skills in the veterinary team context. And to start off with, let's just remind ourselves that there can very often be a triangle of communication between the veterinary team member, the client, and the animal, your patient, which can add a further complication to the dynamic, can't it, Ren? And let's think about communication. So the way you introduce yourself is important. And one of the other things that's really important is non-verbal behaviour.
Yeah, so that's your body language. And of course, that gives people information in the first few seconds of the interaction. And so there's a few really simple things that you can do to help start off on the right foot. And the first one is probably just using your facial expression to be welcoming and relaxed and friendly with a big smile.
And having a neutral professional introduction is good. Sometimes people become a bit abrupt, or sometimes they become a bit too informal, and that can be a bit difficult if it's a more challenging interaction. If you've got off on the wrong foot, it's not very helpful. I think another thing to think about is the mood, your sort of helpful intention.
Yeah.
And often you can set the scene with that before you go into a conversation, reminding yourself that you've got a helpful intention before you start, especially on a bad day.
That's right. And if something is going wrong, then remember you can use language to join with the person. Let's try and sort this out together rather than you against me.
Absolutely. That's such a good point. You're trying to turn it around from, you know, us against each other to us against the problem. And sometimes as a team, even discussing a problem can turn the team together to be able to problem solve it. Thinking about conflict, another thing to remind yourself is to try to avoid the idea of who is right and who is wrong. It can be easier said than done. But sometimes if you're holding on to your fact that you're right and you're going to prove your point, you're actually escalating things. So creating a reminder to yourself that actually the purpose of this is to de-escalate and to try to manage it in a professional way. Rebels is a framework you can use for communication in challenging times. R stands for recognize, so recognizing that there is a problem, recognizing your own initial response to that. So if somebody's being angry, what is your response to that? So don't just go on with your usual way of interacting. E for rebels is to do with empathy. So empathy is where you put yourself in someone else's shoes and you communicate that to them. So you're trying to show that you're getting an understanding of how they might feel, or that you've heard them, you've heard what they're saying and you're repeating that back to them.
B is for boundaries. And on the one hand, we need to be able to connect and empathise, and the other hand, we need to be able to hold our ground and be assertive and stand up for our own needs. So there's 4 really useful steps when you want to hold a boundary. Firstly, identify the behaviour that you're not happy with. It could be someone who's swearing or yelling, so you name the behaviour. So what's a good phrase for that?
So you might often use something like, I noticed that. I noticed that you're banging your fist on the desk, or something like that.
Yeah. So number 2 is having a bottom line sentence, and it's quite good to script this ahead of time if you can, so that you know what you're going to say, and you basically just say what your bottom line is. So it could be something like, swearing is not okay in this clinic. Number 3 is a respectful request, and it's good to just keep this really polite in a pass the butter sort of tone of voice, where you might say, I'd appreciate using respectful tone, please.
And when we're talking about a pass the butter tone of voice, it's basically if you were sitting at a dinner table and you say, can you pass the butter, please? It's not apologetic, it's not aggressive.
Yeah.
You're wanting to have a kind but firm professional attitude. The last step in these 4 steps in a boundary process is consequences. You don't always use this last step, but you sometimes do need to link it to consequences. Something like, if you carry on thumping your fist against the desk, I will have to call security. It doesn't mean that you escalate your tone when you're saying it. You're still using the same tone of voice, but you're making clear that there is a consequence.
Yeah.
After the B in rebels, we have a couple of letters in the middle, the E and the L, that are sort of about the mood you want to create in an interaction. You're emphasizing the person's best interest and you're using inclusive language. So trying to use and instead of but, sometimes using we instead of you and me can be helpful depending on the circumstances.
So we call that joining language, to create that mood of you and me against the problem rather than you against me.
Excellent. And then the last and very important part of the Rebels framework is S, which is for solutions. And if you're going to remember nothing else about Rebels, remember in a challenging interaction, it's really useful to put solutions at the end. Sometimes we jump in and try and fix things and it gets in the way of us actually listening to somebody and can inflame things, can't it?
So try and use a bit of self-discipline. The first part is just reflecting, empathizing, joining language, and then do the solution at the end.
Let's think about the micro skills involved in Rebels. So we've looked at the Rebels framework, and now we're going to look at some of the micro skills behind it, some specific techniques you can use in a challenging interaction setting. There is a very handy technique called verbal arrows, which we suggest that you try out if you haven't tried it.
So this is a visual technique using your imagination. And if someone is insulting you, like they're calling you unprofessional or lazy or something really mean, then you can stand in front of that arrow and make it about you and take it personally. But that's not helpful because it makes it doubly hard. But if you can notice that this is something that I don't have to take on board, you can duck to the side and let that arrow go past. So letting it go.
And one of the things you can do with verbal arrows as you let them go past you is you can listen to what's in the arrow. What is the content of that arrow? Oh, that person's been left waiting. They're very worried about their pet. They had this happen last time they came here. And you can then choose to reflect some of what's in the arrows. So something quite simple like, obviously you're furious because you've been left out here waiting and nobody's come to explain why we're running so late today. Well, I'm very sorry we haven't communicated that to you. So it's a bit of a distancing technique. And my other favorite distancing technique is looking at the bridge of someone's nose instead of looking at their eyes if I'm feeling a bit threatened. Because it can help you feel a bit safer in that interaction.
So don't forget that when things get stressful, it's really important that you know how to calm your own nervous system, using some of those grounding techniques that we'll go into in a bit more detail later on, but basically a letting go breath, feeling your feet on the floor, anything that you know will help calm yourself.
Something I do actually is I curl my toes inside my shoes and then uncurl them again because nobody can see me doing that. And it lets me focus on my body, and then it clears your mind when you let your body do that, or just take a slow breath. Worth practicing these techniques so that it's an automatic thing that you do at a time of pressure.
It's like a secret weapon.
We're going to touch on some well-being strategies, and it's important to remember that the optimal way to improve our well-being is to have organisational responsibilities. Some things are best tackled at a national level, an organisational level, maybe a team level, and also individual levels. So the optimal way, according to the evidence, is for us to do a bit of both. So it's not just up to individuals to upskill or just up to organisations to put some systems in place. So let's just think about what can individuals do. And one of the useful things to remember is an idea about having an upstairs brain and a downstairs brain. Do you want to explain a bit about that, Ren?
So we all want to be in our upstairs brain, which is our, thinking mind. But we all know that if we're upset or emotional, we can't think straight. So in order to be able to think straight, we need to have a reliable couple of skills to calm our nervous system. So the most common ones that you probably have heard of are slow breathing, where you use your diaphragm and particularly letting go with your out breath, and using the body as a bit of an anchor to bring you into the present moment, like feeling your feet, for example.
You can actually feel yourself strongly against the floor. Some people actually imagine they're a tree growing roots into the ground, so they feel nice and strong in a physical situation. Another thing that's really useful to consider is having a very fine-tuned awareness of your own early warning signs of stress, so that you notice your own tendencies under stress, especially you on a bad day as opposed to you on a good day. So what is it that happens? It could be something to do with the way you start thinking. You might become distracted or lose your focus or become very worried. It might be to do with your body. So you might start having flushes or stomach pains, or we have all sorts of things, rashes that happen. And then it might be to do with your behaviour. So you might start to be more irritable or more avoidant. So picking up on these things really early and having some sort of action plan. Oh, I'm noticing I'm doing this. I'm going to make sure I go for a walk when I get a break. And putting that in place is a really handy thing to do.
And knowing what your, say, top 3 most useful early warning signs are, plus your top 3 most useful actions, can be a really good way to have a quick stress management plan.
Just a note here, it's often very easy to notice other people's signs of stress rather than our own. So we would encourage you to think about your own ones. We've just been reading quite a lot about well-being. And one of the things that's really at the top of the evidence at the moment is the importance of having work that is meaningful to you and reminding yourself of what connects you to your values, and to try to do what you can to have a sense of belonging at your workplace. So it's interesting how important that is. And often when we're stuck in the daily grind, we can lose a bit of those bigger picture things. So we wanted to remind you of that.
There's a lot of new evidence around self-compassion, and although that sounds like a bit of a flaky word, it's really about learning to have a kinder, more supportive inner environment so that you can bring out the best in yourself. We know that with other people, if they're anxious or upset, they need support and encouragement. And yet with ourselves, we can often be very critical.
I mean, lots of us in healthcare teams are very hard on ourselves and have a critical inner voice that is what drives us. And it's actually not very helpful. So learning to notice when you're doing that and trying to motivate yourself more kindly can be useful.
You know, the good thing about this is it's very logical. It will work. And we know from the research that you can learn to do it. And there's various ways. Probably one of the best websites is selfcompassion.org, which is by Kristen Neff, one of the primary researchers in self-compassion. And on our website, on the resources page, there's also a little audio clip you can use to train yourself to be more compassionate.
Part of training in self-compassion is actually to do with mindfulness, and we're not going to go into great detail in mindfulness here, but mindfulness is a state of mind where you've got your attention in the present moment, and you're training yourself to choose where you put your attention. And the reason that it can be useful is that it can stop you from spiraling off, ruminating about something negative that happened in the past, or worrying, anticipating some future negative, where you can sort of stop yourself going down that track and notice where your thoughts are and choose where to place them. So a very useful skill. And there are various resources that you can use for that, but there's some very good apps. For instance, Headspace is a good way of training yourself.
Great.
We want to think about working in teams, because of course it's not just one individual at work, we're there in a group. One really handy model we find is Tuckman's model, and it helps to remind us all that there's not necessarily something that is wrong. It might just be that a team is at a certain stage. Anytime a new person joins a team, it shifts the dynamic that's happening. And Tuckman's model has 4 different parts to it. Firstly, a team is forming. Then it is storming, which is often a bit of a tricky time in that team's process. Yes. And after that, it will get to a stage of norming, where everybody decides on their roles and things settle down a bit. And as the team carries on and on, it can start to be performing. The reason we find Tuckman's model useful is sometimes people start blaming individual team members when somebody new joins, but it's actually that the whole team has gone back to the beginning, to the forming process again. And in places where we have a lot of locums or staff changeovers, we often are going in repeatedly round this sort of cycle.
Yeah, and it just normalises the fact that storming happens, and the important thing as a team is not to get stuck in that storming phase, but to realise it's an indication we need some support, we need to work through this so that we can be performing again.
And of course within each team there are the individual people who are there, and all of us have our personalities, our personality tendencies. There's different ways that you can look at this, but one of them we quite like is this 4-animal model.
Which fits very well for vets, doesn't it? So you may have heard of this, and as we talk about them, think about what's your predominant animal personality, and you might also have a secondary personality that you can default to in some situations. So the leader in the team is usually something like a lion. So they're someone who sees the big picture, who sticks their neck out, who is often quite forthright and a bit more extrovert, and they can put themselves on the line in order to make things happen.
And be very decisive. So you need a lion in a team.
You do.
Obviously, if you have more than one,
you might need to default to your secondary role. So the monkey is also a leader actually, but a more playful, creative, often quite likes jokes, really prioritises having a good time, but also very creative. So really good at the front end of a project when you need lots of ideas.
Monkeys can be a bit of a risk taker, but they may not necessarily be very good at finishing things off.
Yes, my son's a monkey. And koalas are prioritising relationship. So they like to be supportive, they'll get alongside people, they make really good teachers. They don't like conflict, so they'll always be wanting to get on well.
Koalas are team players, and about 35% of teams tend to be koalas. And they will, as Ren says, they like to be given more direction and to keep things quiet and to get on with things. Often koalas need to do some training in assertiveness.
That's right, and boundaries.
And boundaries, yeah.
And then lastly, the owl is the thinker, the person who likes to work alone, who's really attentive to detail, who can be a little bit black and white, things are right or wrong. But they're really good to have on a team because they will spot what could go wrong.
And they finish things off. Often an owl has a very defined process of the way they do something. And that is usually very efficient and very effective, but it can be a bit of a clash when it doesn't meet somebody else's idea of what a process should be. So it's not that we are born into being one animal or another. It's just that we tend to behave in one way more than another. And it's very useful to be aware of what your own tendencies are, what your tendencies are in a team, what your preferences are. And when you choose to step into that animal personality, or you choose to sort of step back from it.
The more I learned about this, I've sort of realized that ideally we want to be able to do all four. Maybe that's when you're fully enlightened. That you can be flexible, and if it's needed that you need to be more particular, attentive to detail, you can do that. Or if you can step back and be more supportive, encouraging, and be a koala.
I also know that some teams have actually thought about this when they're recruiting, and they feel that their team is lacking something, and it can be quite a useful thing to think about. So in terms of how we get on with each other, we've been talking about communication, thinking about what do you need to do to get the best out of a koala or a lion or this sort of thing can help you to interact more skillfully with your team members.
So these two models for working in teams can help us when we get stuck in a certain situation or need to take a step back and have a fresh look at what's going on in the team and how do I resource myself so that we can really function optimally. So we've been sent a few questions, and we're going to do a little informal Q&A to sort of go through some of the practical applications of the material that we've covered. So the first one's about how to give feedback and what to do if someone becomes really defensive as soon as you say, well, I've got some feedback for you.
I mean, there's various things you can do there. One thing is having a setup where it's normal that you're giving feedback. You don't need to use the word feedback, but setting up with a junior trainee or somebody that's you're supervising, where you can say, let's have a check-in, every Monday morning or something. So I think having a framework can be really helpful. Remembering to emphasize things that people are doing well as things that they need to work on, that can be really important as well.
Yeah.
Also, normalizing is really helpful. So you can say things like, often when people start doing a job like this, they can feel a bit overwhelmed with X, Y, and Z. How have you been finding it? So that makes the person feel safer and a bit less defensive, I think.
I think the other thing that's really helpful is to make sure you do lots of connecting, because feedback can feel threatening. So if you can say something like, look, I want to make sure that we are all getting on really well, or I want to make sure that we're working together and being really efficient. Can we just talk about that?
And also providing you with the support that you need, so that it can be a good opportunity for identifying what other support they may need. Especially, let's say we've got somebody who's not very confident and who's not performing very well. Often if you get them talking, they will identify the issues themselves. And then you can sort of say, oh yes, it's quite common when people start for them to find this difficult. So.
And just remember the balance between support and challenge, because if someone is not very confident, they're going to need more support. If they're very anxious, they're going to need more support.
Excellent. So what about if you're actually worried about somebody's mental health, somebody in your team, and you think, oh, I really need to say something about this?
Right.
So a bit of a different circumstance then, but it's quite common, isn't it?
And it's a very sensitive topic, and we often feel quite anxious about having to raise it. But it can be good to be really connecting, so that you're really letting the person know, look, I'm noticing that you're not really your normal self at the moment, and I'm wondering if you're okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really good sentence, actually. I'm noticing that, and I'm concerned that, and just stating it. You want to think about where you have that conversation, when you have that conversation, and what your role is. So you think about that in advance, and the limits of your role. How far is that conversation going to go? And the sort of vibe that you're trying to create is you're trying to empower the person to get help if if that's needed, rather than you problem solving for them.
That's right. In fact, problem solving is where we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, which makes us more nervous. And it can be most important to actually just identify that there is an issue. And maybe you can end up with saying, well, let's think about what we can do to sort this out.
Now, somebody was wanting to know, what if you have a particular person you're working with and it's a personality clash, and in fact, it's probably your problem because you just find them annoying? So we are humans working with other humans. So these things happen sometimes.
That's right. And I guess this is actually quite common, isn't it? Because we don't get on with everyone. And being at work is a bit like being in a family where you don't have a choice about it. So you can think about, what part of this is my problem? Because I can't make somebody behave better, but I can change my response to them. So that's where we have to really manage ourselves and use our mindfulness techniques and our grounding techniques and our calming the nervous system techniques, realizing that we're going to have to go in with a bit of a strategy.
It's about self-awareness, really, isn't it? And choosing to not sweat the small stuff, noticing that something's pushing your buttons and just letting it go, I think.
Yeah, and that's where the verbal arrows technique, is really helpful.
Absolutely.
Probably one of the hardest places where you give feedback is if the person is in a more senior position than you, like, for example, your boss. What would you do then, Fiona?
Well, I think it's important, isn't it? Whether it's giving feedback or bringing a point up or asking for something that you need, or in fact, talking about your limits. We are short-staffed and I can't be in two places at once. So it might be having an assertive conversation. It's important to still be able to do that. Sometimes in a hierarchical situation, people go in a group where they go with a couple of them, and that makes them feel a bit better. Thinking in advance about what your key outcome is that you really want, what you're not prepared to compromise on. I think also linking it to drivers that are motivating for senior people. Whether it's safety or productivity,
time management, or
that can be really important. So thinking about what the drivers are before you go, and keeping it simple. You don't want to go with 25 things. Thinking of the most important.
Yeah, remember that phrase, pick your battles. And the other thing is, often if you're feeling really nervous about a conversation, it can be good to do a little very brief agenda and do that in writing. Or even just summarise the problem in writing and then just follow up with a discussion, because that can make you feel a little bit more collected and grounded.
Good point. We've got a question about how do you know when stress is normal stress or when it's become abnormal stress? So that's an interesting thing, because it's a sliding scale, isn't it?
That's right. And it's good. This is where you need a bit of self-reflection, because of course stress does motivate us. We all know how helpful a deadline is to get things done. But at a certain point, the stress starts to be corrosive and I start noticing my early warning signs. So that would be the main thing for me, really, is that I've got 2 or 3 things that I know I start displaying the symptoms of early warning signs of stress. And that's not healthy.
Because a bit of pressure, as you say, can be okay. And we need a mindset where we know that we're in a stressful job and to expect a certain amount of pressure. It's when you start to become distressed. So you're not managing, you're not sleeping. And I think, worrying's a really good example, isn't it? We worry a bit about things. We anticipate the future in a bit of a negative way. But when you're doing that a lot, excessively, it's all the time, or it's keeping you awake at night. There's a time which is good to talk it through with somebody and try to work out what's going on there. So we would say reaching out earlier rather than later is a good idea.
Yeah, that's great. Very good strategies.
Well, that's us at the end of our summary video. And we hope that this snapshot of some of the key content from the webinar series has provided something for you, a mindset, a phrase, or a strategy that you can actually put into use at work.
Yes, this practical summary might be a refresher for those of you who were able to attend previously, or perhaps it's given you some new ideas if this is the first time you've met us. But regardless, we wish you all the best in your work, and thank you for taking some time to prioritise your well-being and fine-tune your communication skills with us.
Take care now. Goodbye. Ka kite anō.
See you next time.